Welcome all to Everyone a Spokesperson. My name is Christina Gogri-Campbell, and I'm the Director of Strategic Communications at Independent Sector, a diverse community of nonprofits, foundations, and corporate giving programs working to ensure all people in the United States thrive. This webinar is brought to you by Independent Sector and Prosper Strategies, the leading marketing and communications consultancy for the nonprofit sector. I'm joined here by our moderator, Alyssa Conrardy, President of Prosper Strategies, and Amy Levner, Vice President of Marketing and Communications at KaBOOM, a national nonprofit dedicated to bringing balanced and active play to the daily lives of all kids, particularly those growing up in poverty in America. Many of you have joined us for earlier webinars in this series. This is the 5th in a 13-part series Prosper Strategies put together for us, focused on the concepts in their nonprofit marketing manifesto, which lays out 10 commitments nonprofits must take to increase their mission impact through marketing. You can find previous webinars at prosper-strategies.com/webinars, and we'll send a recording of this webinar later this week. In December's webinar, we introduced the manifesto as a whole, and then each month since then, we've covered another of the commitments. If you don't already have the manifesto, you can find it at the link on your screen. This month's focus is Commitment 4, which says we will treat all our stakeholders as brand ambassadors. We'll send around the recording and slides, so don't worry about taking too many notes. And we can't wait for this important discussion, so without further ado, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Alyssa, President of Prosper Strategies, to help us get started and to introduce our guests.
Thanks so much, Christina. And as always, we are really excited to be here with all of you today. Amy, thank you so much for joining as our guest. Can't wait for what should be a great discussion. But before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to help you all orient yourselves in GoToWebinar and greet some of you who are on the line. So please go ahead and find either the questions box or the chat box. Which one you use will depend on which version of GoToWebinar you're using. And type in your name, your organization's name, your title, and where you're calling in from. And I will go ahead and read off some of the people that we have on the webinar today. So don't worry if you don't hear your name, you're still on. We're just getting a lot of responses, and I'll read as many as I can. Welcome Rachel Dooley. She's the CMO at the Cybercrime Support Network in Baltimore. Welcome David from New Mexico, MBR Camp Designing Director. We have Richard from Montclair, New Jersey. Haley Pittman, the Program Manager at Teaching Trust in Dallas, Texas. Welcome. We have Heidi, Marketing and Volunteer Team from Neighbors, Inc. Liz Hurst from San Francisco, Summer Search VP of Marketing. Melissa Cooper, One Goal, Director of Partnerships and Support, Atlanta, Georgia. Tulin from Good Social, Chief Impact Officer in San Jose. Keep pouring in here. I'm not going to get to the bottom of this list by any stretch, but hopefully that gives you a sense of the wide range of titles and locations and organizations that we have on the line today. Really great cross-section, and looking forward to hearing from all of you as you continue to participate through the questions or chat box during today's webinar. Either one of those spots are great spots for you to interact with us, ask questions at any point throughout today's webinar. We'll be monitoring the questions box, and we'll come back to it about the last 30 minutes or so, maybe a little earlier of the webinar. We'll come back to as many of your questions as we possibly can for both Amy and myself. So with that said, really looking forward to getting going on today's conversation. Okay, so before we dive in, here is our agenda for today's session. We will start with an introduction from me to commitment number 4, which Christina already introduced a little bit when she brought us into the webinar. We'll then transition to a Q&A with Amy based on some questions that I've prepared, some things that I know you all are interested in as well. And then we'll spend, like I said, at least 30 minutes taking your questions. Finally, we'll wrap up with a preview of next month's webinar on commitment number 5. So I hope you are all excited to get started. Let's go ahead and dive in. So commitment number 4, this is a really interesting one to talk about because it's one that I think all organizations can make, whether your organization is big or small, no budget or huge budget. And it's a commitment to treat all of our stakeholders as brand ambassadors. I'm going to go ahead and just take 1 second here to adjust an audio issue that I'm seeing some of you chatting in about. I'm seeing some of you saying there's music in the background. Not sure where that's coming from, but let me just take a second here to make sure we can take care of it. If anyone somehow has their audio turned on, you shouldn't be able to. Please go ahead and turn off any audio as participants. Not sure if that's on independent sector side or ours. Someone just chat in and let me know if that's getting better for everyone. I can't hear anything on my end. Still there, still on. Okay. It's a radio station. What in the world? Let me just take a moment. Excuse me here while I try to troubleshoot what's going on. Okay, the music's gone. We're in good shape. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but can you all hear me now okay? Chat in and let me know if there's any issues or if it seems better. All right, everyone's saying we're better. Thank you for your patience. Not sure what the radio station was or where it was coming from, but I'm happy to hear it's gone. So anyway, let's dive back in right where we left off with commitment number 4. As I was saying, this is one that really every organization can make. And I feel that way about all of the commitments, but this one in particular is one that doesn't require a huge budget, a major investment, even a big strategic conversation with your leadership. It just requires making the decision to treat your stakeholders as brand ambassadors. So what does that mean? It means that we'll recognize that every person our organizations interact with has the potential to amplify our brands, our mission, and our impact. And in the not so distant past, many nonprofits and organizations in general lived in what I would call a single spokesperson world, where they could really closely control the message that they put out into the public. But today we know that we're no longer living in that world. That time has ended. And if you ask me, that's really a good thing. Social media and other digital tools have created this world where truly every person you interact with can become an ambassador for your nonprofit, for its brand, for the organization, for the mission. And the question then becomes, are you going to encourage it or resist it? Since you're on this webinar, I'm going to assume that you want to encourage more of your stakeholders to become ambassadors from your brand, but you need some guidance on how to do so. And that's what we're going to focus on today. But first, I'd like to cover just a couple of definitions. What's a stakeholder? Stakeholder refers to anyone, individual or group, who has an interest in your nonprofit. So this is pretty broad. It includes people directly involved, such as your board members, people you serve, also includes donors, foundations that give you grants. People who care about the work you're doing are your stakeholders, plain and simple. You can probably list at least half a dozen stakeholder groups that matter for your organization off the top of your head right now, maybe many more. Second, what is a brand ambassador? For the purpose of today's discussion, I'd like to define brand ambassador as a person who represents a brand or organization in a positive light, and when they do so, they help increase brand awareness and engagement. Brand ambassadors are not necessarily paid, and they don't necessarily exist in an official capacity, at least not for the purpose of today's conversation, but they can have a big impact nonetheless. And finally, what is a spokesperson? A spokesperson is an individual who's appointed by your organization to speak publicly and on the record on your behalf. Typically, most of the time, let's say 99% of situations, a spokesperson is an employee or a paid representative of your organization. And today, we're going to focus on talking more about brand ambassadors than we are about spokespeople. We will bring up spokespeople in that distinction a little bit more in a later conversation with Amy, but I want you to think primarily about this unofficial and unpaid brand ambassador for today's conversation. As nonprofit leaders and marketing communications professionals, which most of you are who are on the line here today, we should all strive to turn our stakeholders into brand ambassadors and do that as often as we possibly can. Because to put it simply, brand ambassadors provide free marketing for our organizations. And Their positive promotion, words of affirmation about what you're doing has the ability to be far more powerful than any marketing or advertising, so to speak, that you could buy. So what does a stakeholder need to become a brand ambassador? That is really the question here. And there are 4 somewhat simple, or at least they sound simple on the surface, requirements. Those requirements are encouragement, training, tools, and support. So let's spend just a minute or two breaking each of these down. First off, encouragement. Your stakeholders need to know that you want them to talk about and promote your organization. You can make this clear to them in a whole variety of ways, from email campaigns to social media posts to things like peer-to-peer fundraising programs. Don't assume that your stakeholders know what you want from them. Ask them to advocate for you early and often. And don't feel bad about asking for that. They're excited to do it. They just may need a reminder. Second, your stakeholders often need training. That's especially true for your internal stakeholders like staff, board members, and volunteers. Being a brand ambassador really does not come easily to most people, and that can be easily forgotten, especially if you're someone who works in marketing and speaks this language all the time. But it's not natural for a lot of people. And even when it is, unless you provide some sort of training, you can be sure, I'll bet money on it, that your stakeholders will misrepresent your brand unintentionally. They'll say things that are really specific to their work and may be powerful for a very specific group, but they're not the message that you want to put out into the world broadly. So that's why we suggest holding trainings at least a couple of times a year for your internal stakeholders, where you can really help them understand what your organization wants to be known for and how they can communicate about it. Using the key message matrices that we introduced last month in our webinar with Valentina from the Great Books Foundation can be really helpful here. So if you want to look back at last month's webinar, it has some great tools for this purpose. And talked a lot about training for internal stakeholders, but it can also work for external stakeholders, though it would need to be, in most situations, a lot less formal. So for example, you might do something like use your social media to provide informal training for your external stakeholders about how they can promote your organization. One of our clients actually recently posted a video to their Facebook page for their supporters titled something like "How to Talk to Your Friends About Why You Support Us." And it was their CEO, just sort of a desk side conversation, talking about some key messages that donors and other types of supporters can use when they're spreading the word about why they care about that organization. It was a really natural conversational video, and it got thousands of views, extremely well received. Of course, there's no way to know exactly how people are using that informal training and in their messaging, your external stakeholders, but any training is better than none. So that's a great effort on their end, and one that you can replicate and emulate on yours. The third requirement to turn stakeholders into brand ambassadors is tools. So the more communications tools you can provide your stakeholders with, both internally and externally, the easier it will be for them to promote your organization. And I'm speaking broadly here when I talk about tools. So tools can be anything from social media post templates to fundraising letters that your existing donors can forward to their friends, to just really simple postcards or things like that that you might include in mail packages. You might even think about, if you want to get a bit more advanced with this, creating a brand ambassador portal where you can post things like your key messages, logos, photography, posts and email templates, and other tools that your stakeholders can use to promote your organization. And I'll share some examples of that in a little while here. And then finally, and probably most importantly, your stakeholders require support to become effective brand ambassadors. And by support, I mean that they want to know that their efforts to promote your organization do not go unnoticed. Just like anyone, your supporters want to be acknowledged. They want to be thanked and praised for the work they're doing to advance your cause. They want that sort of gold star, that social proof for the work they're doing to support you. And as your efforts to encourage brand advocacy advance, you might take your support systems to the next level. Hopefully you're doing simple things like just saying thanks or sending thank you letters. But if you take things to the next level, you might even establish some sort of incentives for people who promote your organization and its work on a regular basis. Incentives, we want to make sure we're authentic about this and that it feels in line with the mission. But They could range from invitations to your events to acknowledgement on your website to possibly exclusive opportunities to interact with the people and communities your organization serve. We can do some more talking about this with Amy too in terms of what KaBOOM is doing. But like I said, think about what feels authentic and aligned with your organization and its values, what your supporters and stakeholders might see value in getting as a nod or an accolade for their support of the work you're doing. Before I move on to our next slide here, Sarah, I saw you ask the question, can we share last month's webinar? I will go ahead and write into the chat box the link to all the webinars right now. This is where all of our previous webinars are posted. If you look in the chat box, there should be 4 previous webinars. This recording will go up within a matter of days as well at that same spot. So if you're looking for that key message matrix or anything else from the last webinar, that's where you'll find it. So let's go ahead and look at an example of an organization that's really winning, in addition to KaBOOM, which of course we'll be talking about a lot today, at turning their stakeholders into brand ambassadors. And no surprise to a lot of you, a classic example that gets pointed to often is Charity Water. Encouragement to promote their brand is literally everywhere in Charity Water's marketing and brand presence. And informal training on how to be an ambassador for the brand takes place all the time. They might not call it that and you might not notice it, but it's happening all the time through their social media platforms, webinars, events, and things like that. And what you're seeing here on your screen is just a few examples of the tools that they provide their stakeholders to help them tell the Charity Water story, from video to Facebook photos and other downloads, things that are really accessible and easy for different types of supporters to grab and use on their own. Where Charity Water is really winning, though, is in the support part of this process. Charity Water is celebrating its brand advocates in everything they do. It's a huge cornerstone of their approach to marketing and stewardship. So, for example, you can see here they've created hundreds of pages, like this one that you're seeing up on your screen, that tell the story of individual donors or water projects and brand advocates behind them. They tie the support that they're getting to specific metrics and to individuals who are deeply involved as both donors and brand ambassadors. So, for example, here you can see that those who campaigned for Rachel, who I'll tell you about a little bit more in just a minute, brought water to over 37,000 people in Ethiopia. This is measurable, it's displayed on their website, it's shareable. They're giving that support and that nod to brand ambassadors and donors here. Even more notable, and not every organization can do this, but some inspiration can be taken from it, Charity Water picks specific brand advocates to involve in the front lines of their work all the time. You probably know this if you follow them. They often send donors and other brand advocates on trips to participate in and see the impact of the water projects that they help fund. Of course, Charity Water, being the shining example they are, misses no opportunity to document their support for their brand advocates. So what you're seeing here is a video of Rachel, who I mentioned a moment ago, Rachel Beckwith's mom, participating in and visiting a water project in Ethiopia. This is a really powerful story and not uncommon for Charity Water. Rachel was a 9-year-old who was killed in a tragic car accident. And after her death, her mother and other family members organized a really successful Charity Water fundraiser in her memory. You just saw the metrics from that fundraiser on the previous slide. And in return, Charity Water sent her, Rachel's mother, to observe and play a role in the project that her daughter's memory helped fund. They documented the entire day on video, shared it through their website, their social, and it was a really powerful moment, authentically, for Rachel's mom and for all of the people who supported her and missed and remembered Rachel, and for Charity Water as a brand, of course. If you follow them, you know that this isn't a one-off effort. This practice is common for Charity Water. So now that you know what it takes for a stakeholder to become a brand ambassador, how can you go about building your own brand ambassador program? We could spend probably a week's worth of webinars on this, but I will cover the 7 steps that you'll see here in high-level detail, and then we'll dig into each one of them a bit more with Amy. So like I said, there's 7 steps, and it starts with identifying your stakeholders. So this is really just a matter of sitting down with your team and making an exhaustive list of literally everyone you can think of who might be a stakeholder. That means, as you'll remember, they have some interest in your organization. This could be everyone from your donors to your board members, volunteers, staff, the people you serve, your funders, the list goes on and on. Then rank this master list based on their ability or interest in serving as a brand ambassador. So you'll have a big long list of people who could be stakeholders, and I'd like you to give them a score from 1 to 10 based on how likely they might be to actually act as an active brand ambassador. You're guessing here, but you should have a pretty good sense. Score them from 1 to 10 and then prioritize your list from the highest score to the lowest score. You'll then want to really think about how far are you going to go in turning these these stakeholders into brand ambassadors. Unless your organization is huge, has a huge budget, huge communications and marketing team, you'll probably want to focus on those who ranked in the top, let's say 3 to 6 groups as you ranked your stakeholders for their likelihood to become brand ambassadors. And next, you will then want to understand how those top groups, the ones you're probably going to focus on, think and what they care about. It's a good idea here to do some research. So conduct some interviews, survey these stakeholder groups who you think you might focus on turning into brand ambassadors, or just find other ways to get their input. Some of this input might even just come in natural conversation. So once you understand what would motivate your top stakeholders to become brand ambassadors, what they think about, what they care about, it's time to audit your current resources through this lens and determine what you might need to create or develop to have an effective brand ambassador program. For example, as you do some research, you conduct interviews or surveys, you might find that these stakeholder groups you're prioritizing say that they primarily want to advocate for your brand through social media, but you don't have a library of photos or post templates at the ready for them. And if that's the case, as an example, you've just identified a need. You need to create some social media assets because these priority groups care about using social as a tool to become brand ambassadors. So you want to identify as many of those needs as you possibly can. Things that you've heard your focused brand ambassadors say they would be likely to use or leverage to talk about your brand that you don't have. Once you've identified as many of the needs as possible, you want to go ahead and set priorities for what you'll need to do and develop to successfully turn your stakeholders into brand ambassadors. If you've been on previous webinars, you probably know that I'm a big fan of priorities. We are all human, we can't do it all, so you really need to think about what is most critical, what based on the size of our team and all the other things we have on our plate can we actually get done, and then document those priorities. For each priority, as with any priority in any area of marketing communications, make sure that you identify who's responsible for seeing the priority through and set a timeline. I like to have as few kind of guiding strategic documents for my clients' marketing departments, communications departments as I can. So I recommend documenting this as part of your overall marketing plan or in your project management system so that any work you're doing around building a brand advocacy program is kind of viewed within the lens of your broader marketing and communication strategy. And finally, after you have all of that documented, you have your priorities set, as you begin to actually roll out your brand ambassador program, you'll want to make sure that you set some goals. These can also be documented in your marketing plan, and that you're regularly evaluating the results that you're getting out of your brand ambassador work against your goals to determine what's working and where you need to improve. If you do any sort of metrics reporting for your organization on a regular, quarterly or monthly basis, have some metrics that you can check in on to say what's working and what's not from a brand ambassador perspective. There's a whole lot more we could get into with that, what sorts of metrics you should be measuring, how to measure them, how you can tell how people are speaking on behalf of your brand, but we'll save that for the Q&A and later discussion. So just 7 steps massively oversimplifies this process, and we all know that these sorts of things become much more complex in practice than they sound in theory. So that's why I'm excited to dig into this topic further today with Amy, who is building a brand ambassador program in the real world at KaBOOM. So welcome, Amy. I have a ton of questions for you that I can't wait to get into. But before we go there, why don't you spend just a moment introducing yourself to our audience and telling them a little bit more about you and your work at KaBOOM.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alyssa. It's nice to be with you all today. I'm really excited to talk about our brand ambassadors at KaBOOM and try to share what we're learning and also some of the ways that we've messed up and are still learning because we certainly do not have it all figured out. In fact, I was just scribbling notes as Alyssa was talking, so maybe you all can share some of your successes with me too. So I have been at KaBOOM for about 3.5 years now, almost 4 years, and I have one of those very nonprofit sector kind of backgrounds where I am a generalist. I've done it all from brand to communications to marketing, and I do a bit of that, everything in that realm at KaBOOM. I essentially say that anything that's publicly facing about KaBOOM comes through my team and my shop. Just a little note about KaBOOM to give you all some context too as we start to walk through the stakeholder questions and brand ambassador questions. KaBOOM's a national nonprofit, for those of you who may not have heard of us. We are based in DC, and we've been around for about 23 years. And from day one, we have been working with local communities that are traditionally underinvested, the victims or unfortunate situations where they have experienced structural racism, lots of underfunding, really gross ignorance of the needs that they have in the community. And we've been partnering with them to focus on making sure that kids can grow up healthy and happy and thrive. And the way our means to that end is by building playgrounds and building amazing places for kids to play. And what's going to become clear as we talk, I think, today is that the easiest part of the process, and I have some colleagues internally who would probably disagree with me, but the easiest thing we do is we bring 200 volunteers together and in a local community, and we all roll up our sleeves, and in 6 hours, we do what we call an urban barn raising and build a new play space. And it's an amazing, magical kind of project. We do about 150 of those a year, and we do everything from traditional play spaces that you might see at a school or a housing complex or a park to these amazing adventure courses, which are for older kids. They're think American Ninja Warrior style courses, to multi-sport courts where kids can play basketball. We try to extend childhood and meet all aspects of childhood. And our ultimate goal is to do that work in a more systemic way. So in addition to doing play spaces in one school in a city, what would it look like for us to do all the play spaces that are needed across the city system? Think a city like Baltimore. So we have a lot of ambitions, and our work is actually much broader and more complex than what our brand is known for today. So I know we'll get into some of that as Alyssa and I talk here, but I wanted to set that context for you all and give you that background as we continue to talk about our brand ambassadors.
Very good. Well, thank you, Amy, and your work is appreciated, I know, by so many. But just one quick note here, Eric, who is from Cleveland, Tennessee Boys and Girls Clubs, he just chatted in that KaBOOM has been a huge blessing to the clubs and our organization, truly amazing playground. So nice to see the connection there.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. We've actually done a lot of projects. I think a couple hundred Boys and Girls Clubs across the country at this point. They're amazing, amazing community partners of ours. So thank you. That's wonderful.
Fabulous. Okay, well, thank you so much for the great introduction, Amy. And we have so much to cover here. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in with the first question. One of my questions that I always like to ask at the beginning of these webinars is, why is this commitment important to you? Why do you care about treating all of your stakeholders as brand ambassadors at KaBOOM?
Yeah, you know, the most important thing is that it would be very easy to think that our work is about one specific project or the day that we actually put the playground into the ground. And really, our work is about what happens in the community as we plan towards building that play space together, and then what happens after, what continues to happen because people from all backgrounds and walks of life have come together to work on a project that they at once thought might not be able to happen. And so for us, we need to make sure that our stakeholders and our ambassadors really can help us keep that momentum going and tell the stories that happen way beyond the time that the play space goes in the ground. So it's really important to keep that work going so that ultimately we can reach our vision of making sure that kids can grow up healthy and happy.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, and I really like the idea of thinking about the whole lifespan of your engagement with your stakeholders too, right? Not just that initial touch point, but what happens after. So critically important, especially with the type of work that KaBOOM does.
Absolutely.
Okay. So you've talked already a little bit about the fact that you have a wide range of diverse stakeholders. Who do you consider to be, if you had to do that exercise where you prioritized, who do you consider to be KaBOOM's 4 or 5 main groups of stakeholders?
Yeah, so what you're looking at here on the screen is a slide that we presented to our board. I know you're all cringing when I talk about board meetings, but that we presented to our board. Our board is actually really wonderful last year, and this is to lay out KaBOOM is undergoing a brand refresh, a brand reimagining right now. We're right in the middle of it, and this slide lays out what our plans are. And our initial frankly, the most important part of this work is getting to know the stakeholders that you see there in the middle of the slide even better. So our stakeholders are corporate and philanthropic funders, so the entities that make sure that the work can actually get done. They fund our work, they fund the physical equipment itself and bring the projects to life. Municipal leaders, so those are city officials, mayors, transportation heads, department heads, folks who are responsible for making cities run. It's really important for us to partner with them, particularly as we're looking to expand into affecting city systems at scale. And perhaps actually our most important partners are folks like Eric, who are in communities, our partners who are actually receiving the play space and are the ones who have been doing massive work to increase community pride and community cohesion and are continuing to do that work. And the play space is a way for them to come together and do something for the kids that live there. And then finally, influencers, and this is our catch-all category, but we do think of it as more of a B2B kind of category in that these are the folks, nonprofit leaders, city and urban design planners and leaders, people who are experts in fields that might touch ours, like education or, transportation or city systems, people who have connections to all of the other stakeholders and can influence them as well and shine a light on what we do. Mm-hmm. And then the bottom part of that is essentially our plan. We're right now in the midst of finding out what makes those stakeholders tick. Why do they work with us? What do they like about working with us? What about our cause appeals to them? Why are they committed to the work that we're doing? So that we can then go back out and talk about the work that we're doing in a much broader yet really focused way.
That's excellent. And Amy, can you talk a little bit about what you're doing to get to know them better? Are you conducting focus groups, surveys? What types of research tools are you using, or is it less formal than that?
Sure. No, it's actually, we're doing it much more formally right now because this slide was all about securing funding from funding approval to make sure that we could do that. So we've hired an external agency, the Purpose Agency, and they are doing that work for us. They have interviewed board members, KaBOOM staff, and then select stakeholders from each of these groups of audiences that you see here. They're actually just wrapped up those interviews, and we're about to get a report on that next week. So what they're doing is it's qualitative in nature for sure, and what they're doing is really deep and intense. Yet, to be honest, it's taken us a few years to get to the point where we were ready to ask for the funding and do that stakeholder engagement. We have also, on the other end of the financial spectrum, we just recently did a survey via our email list to find out why our individual donors are giving to KaBOOM. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of ways. I mean, you can do everything from survey money to even doing post-project interviews with your stakeholders, informal conversations, all the way to formal external engagements, depending on the kind of information you're trying to get. Since
Right.
this is a part of a whole brand refresh, it makes sense for us to do this in a cohesive way.
Absolutely. And that's a great time. A brand refresh is a great time to think about building a brand ambassador program, right? This can be a part of that is as we update the brand, what can we learn about our stakeholders that will, one, just help our work appeal to them in new and different ways, but two, also make it easier for them to talk about us and promote the work that we're doing. So I completely agree. There's such a range of research tools you can use. I think you named all the tools that we use most frequently here to get to know these stakeholders as we think about them as brand ambassadors. And if you can swing it for those of you on the line who are thinking about getting to know your stakeholders better, I would definitely suggest a mix of qualitative and quantitative research because you get different things from both. So it can work really well to combine a survey with interviews or a survey with focus groups, for example. Okay. So I'd like to hear a little bit more, Amy, about what KaBOOM has done in the past. And I know there's a lot of things in flux right now as you reimagine the brand, but what you've done in the past to empower those groups and others to serve as ambassadors for your brand. How have you gotten them to really promote KaBOOM and speak on your behalf?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because the reason we're calling the work a brand refresh and a brand reimagining is that we actually want to build on the solid foundation of the work that we've been doing to date. And so it's not like we need to completely rebrand or start talking about completely new ways of doing work or new methods. It's more about how do we build on what we do well and add to that? And so in that way, that actually applies to the brand ambassador and stakeholder planning programs because we've been doing this. We just need to do it better now. And so for us, what we've done in the past is for every single project I mentioned, we do communications planning. So we do communications planning at several levels. So one might be, okay, what is the issue or the set of issues that this community is trying to address or that this project is going to help us address even in the larger ecosystem beyond just the work that KaBOOM does. So an example might be we did a project in Chicago in the past year, and it was a community that was recovering from, as you can imagine, unfortunately in Chicago, years of gun violence. And so the work that we did to bring two communities together to build a play space also connected in a larger way to community safety and bringing a sense of safety and cohesion to a community. So we're thinking about issues at that level. And then we're also doing planning with our partners themselves. What is the reason the funding partner wants to do work in Chicago, for example? Or what is the community partner trying to accomplish for themselves and for the kids that live in their community? So that planning up front is incredibly important, and determining those key issues in advance is important because then you can focus the rest of the strategy, the key pieces around that framing.
Right. Right. So you're sort of doing a mini research process into the stakeholders for each and every project.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And now you just have an opportunity to formalize and do things on a bit of a bigger scale with the brand refresh.
Yeah, and I think in the past what we've done really well, I mean, you all actually just saw it in action, how Eric chimed in and said, hey, we love KaBOOM in Tennessee. Thank you so much, right? I think we've done a wonderful job of paying attention to our funding partners and our community partners and making sure that they are getting the resources they need, that they are getting the spotlight shined on them, that they are appreciated and held up for the work that they're doing. What we could do a better job of, I think, is focusing that same level of commitment on our influencer stakeholders, being much more proactive with them, and also being much more proactive with municipal leaders as well.
Sure. Is being proactive with that influencer group possibly a bit more difficult given that that's sort of a catch-all category and the needs range so widely?
Absolutely. And I think that what we can do is think about that in terms of the channel. So what are our relationships with some of the key influencers who are having conversations on social media? Twitter and LinkedIn are two places where we've focused on trying to build individual relationships with brand ambassadors. So we just recently, I'll give you an example of how we did this with an influencer. We built a playground with Kid President a few years ago, and we put a post up on social media on the anniversary of that project and said, oh, we're so excited that this playground is still in existence here, and thank you again to Kid President. And the guy who runs that program tweeted back at us and said, oh, KaBOOM, I love you guys. I'm so glad that you reminded us of that awesome day. And then we started direct messaging with him, and he even said, I think on his public tweet, hey, I've got some new ideas, reach out to me. And so it was a nice way to re-engage with an influencer, who we might not be able to, like you said, Alyssa, reach out to all the time, but it gave us that opportunity to start a conversation. And I think we have to be really opportunistic with our influencers like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that requires some serious effort, right? To be looking for those opportunities, monitoring for them when they arise, and then making sure that whoever is managing things like your social channels has the insight into the work in order to have a good, authentic conversation and not, sort of say the wrong thing or miscommunicate about the work you've already done together. That takes work and coordination. So I can understand, especially with a group like that, that's really kind of broad and a catch-all, where that can be challenging and difficult, but also hold a ton of opportunity.
Absolutely. I mean, for us, hiring for instinct is really important, particularly with the person who is in our social media seat right now, and she's amazing. I wanted to make sure when we brought her on board that she had the instincts to do everything that you were talking about doing.
So critical. You cannot possibly patrol that type of role, right? And it would be completely counterproductive to have to clear everything a social media manager is doing with a set of approved key messages or executive sign off. So yes, that instinct, that gut feel for how to have these sorts of conversations and when to hold back versus continue a conversation, so critical. We could go on about that for a long time, I'm sure. So, Amy, are there any other sort of new initiatives that you're really excited about when you think about turning more of your stakeholders into brand ambassadors?
Yes. The reason we're doing this brand refresh is that we're trying to address this perception gap that we have around the work that we've been doing over the last 20 years and the increased breadth and complexity of the work that we're doing now. And so that, again, is allowing us to take some time. One of the challenges for us is that, and I think that other nonprofits might identify with this, is figuring out when and how to take credit. And we want the spotlight and the accolades for the work and the feedback for the work that we do to really land on our community partners and in some cases our funding partners as well. But that means that we are often in the back seat. And we've built up years and years of expertise that is too well kept a secret. So figuring out where and how to, beat our chest a little bit and say, hey, yeah, we're experts and without us, these projects wouldn't happen. Doing that in the right way, making sure that lands well with people, that's our big challenge, and it's actually a really exciting opportunity, as you can imagine, for folks that are in our field to try to manage through and message around.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So can you give us an example of one of the more creative ways, whether it was something that you encouraged or just happened, that a stakeholder acted as a brand ambassador for KaBOOM in the past?
Absolutely. So we have this wonderful years-long relationship with the CarMax Foundation. They're one of our major funders, and they're incredible. And, I was just talking about this whole credibility or taking credit kind of conversation. And we have an annual planning meeting with them, and they brought up, and they were so uncomfortable, but they said, we're not getting the media attention that we would like. And we understand that our community partners should get it and they deserve it. But we're just trying to figure out how we can at least get mentioned, right? And so it was, so they were approaching it from a really great place. And one of my colleagues on our team, who's a rural communications dynamo, said, well, have you all ever tried sharing the message about KaBOOM and why you're actually doing this work and what's going to happen in the community? So instead of saying, CarMax is here, we funded this amazing play space, we're so excited to be a part of making sure that, kids get a chance to play, they pivoted and we literally handed them our talking points that we usually give our project managers who are on site. They took those talking points and said, oh, we're here today because this community has been struggling for years. They have one slide at an elementary school for 800 kids, and that's ridiculous, and that shouldn't happen, and we want to be a part of making sure that all kids get a chance to play and grow up healthy and happy. And, what do you think happened? They got mentioned a ton and their media went straight up. And so it was actually a great lesson for us too, because I think we can, all the partners involved, if we talk about each other, it comes across as much more credible than if we're trying to all just toot our own horns and say what our role is in the process.
It absolutely does. And journalists have a nose for that. And so does the audience, right? We all are just so much more receptive to hearing an organization applaud or, promote another, especially when it comes to nonprofits than themselves. It's our natural tendency to be attracted to that sort of communication. So it absolutely makes sense that worked well for them. And I think for their brand, it was a far better look as well.
Absolutely.
That's great. Okay, so this is something that I think a lot of people on the line are probably wondering. Have you found ways to ensure that you're keeping messaging and communications consistent among those who serve either officially or, and more importantly, unofficially as brand ambassadors without sort of over-managing them?
Well, yes, and I'm going to maybe take what is a non-traditional approach. We actually try not to worry too much about consistency. Mm-hmm. Our goal is to get everyone to talk about the work that we're doing and that we're all doing together in their own voices and in their own way and from their own experience. It gets to that authenticity piece that you were talking about earlier, Alyssa. It's really helpful for us if we let our partners and our stakeholders talk about things from their point of view. So we try to worry less about consistency. And I'll tell you, it actually makes our staff more uncomfortable, because you were talking at the top about the fact that not everyone is comfortable being a brand ambassador. Not everyone's comfortable being a spokesperson. Well, we're an organization filled with spokespeople because we have a lot of people who are out in the field working on projects, and they want to make sure they're saying the exact right thing every single time. And so our training is, here's the general outline. We want you to talk about the work in your own voice from your own experience. And I think that just makes it more valuable.
So it's a guidelines, not ground rules sort of situation. You provide some help and some support of key messages or things that they might say, but then they're really free to personalize, and your team is free to let them do that and not worry about policing communications.
Absolutely. And if you're doing the right planning up front, I talked about the communications planning we do for every project, and then also that we do with our major partners and for our major initiatives. If we've done a good job of framing and defining the issues up front and defining the communications goals up front, then we don't have to worry as much about consistency because everyone is on the same page about what we're all trying to accomplish.
Right. It happens at that ground level of the communications planning for the project.
Right.
Great. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but I want to dig into it further. Your stakeholder groups are pretty diverse. How has that impacted the ways that you've thought about your strategies for encouraging different groups to act as brand ambassadors?
Yeah, I mean, we have done a good job of giving our partners that are involved, and you can see them all high-fiving each other in developing the space themselves. We have to do a little bit more for the groups that are actually on the ground doing the work. And we try to do more to help train them, and particularly our community partners really vary. Some are really comfortable with publicity and just publicly talking about the work they do. Others aren't, and so we have to adjust our training based on where they are. And then the way our funding partners work, some of them want to have more of a spotlight than others. So it feels like we are, again, doing that planning up front and adjusting to those stakeholder groups. And then the ones that, I mentioned earlier where I feel like we have some work to do to be more proactive with our influencers and with our municipal leaders. That's something that we're really looking forward to doing, because we think they're going to be able to tell the story and the power of the work that we do in several different areas. And so, again, we need to figure out which issues we're trying to address and then give them the key points that we want them to get across.
It's such a big opportunity, though. I think you're right to be excited for that. It's great. Okay. So we've talked a lot about stakeholders acting as ambassadors for KaBOOM, but what about when stakeholders act as ambassadors for your cause overall? That's also such an important part of this. Can you give us some examples of times when that has happened?
Absolutely. I think that this happens quite a bit, and it's actually one of the things that we're really excited about, the focus that we're taking with a lot of our city partnerships. A lot of those stakeholders who, for example, in Detroit, we've been working really closely with the Parks and Rec department. And so they're not a community member and they're not funding the work. They are making sure that we are going to the places where the spaces that kids can play and where families can gather are happening in the places that need them most. And so they become then, they can talk about the cause from a level up from the partners that are actually doing the work to get the play space built. And so that has been a real benefit to us in terms of helping others tell our story. And we've actually seen, this is what it's resulted in, which is ultimately what we want to have happen, is other city leaders calling us because they met someone from Detroit Parks who had a great experience with us. And, the city leaders in New Orleans called us and said, hey, we heard what you just did at this park in Detroit. We've got this other project. Why don't you come here and talk to us about that? So that kind of what others are saying while we're not in the room is really important, and that's the way that we're trying to leverage our ambassadors to talk about our cause.
That's pretty ideal to have situations like that play out.
Absolutely.
That's great. So we've talked mostly about brand ambassadors, and I did promise that we would circle back to spokespeople. Do you have official spokespeople at KaBOOM? And if so, who are they? How do they differ from these less official brand ambassadors?
Yeah, unlike a lot of nonprofits, perhaps, or maybe you all are in the same boat we are, we actually have a lot of stakeholders. A lot of spokespeople. And in fact, I talk about it being an embarrassment of riches because we have a lot of people who can really eloquently talk about the work that we're doing and represent the brand. And that starts, fortunately, at our CEO level and our senior staff, of course. That's who you would think of. But we also have people who are pretty early in their careers leading the projects on the ground who are acting as spokespeople and representing that project, that community, that piece of work. So we do a lot of internal training depending on where the stakeholders sit. And then we also just assume that every single person at KaBOOM is a brand ambassador. Mm-hmm. We have a really great story to tell and a story and a cause that's really compelling. It's hard to be against making sure kids have great places to play.
Right.
So people are really drawn to it. And, so we all end up in interesting conversations wherever we go, no matter what, specific hat we might be wearing internally.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Really helpful.
I'll tell you a funny side story. Our finance team is the most excited about this brand refresh. Once they got over the sticker shock of what what it would cost, they want to be involved because they're talking to vendors all the time. And in fact, one of our, our accounts payable staff person said, I need to be able to talk about KaBOOM at my family barbecue. So, it really is about everybody.
That's great. That's so awesome. Not the player that you would expect to be most excited about a brand refresh.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So hate to turn from such a positive to a bit of a negative here, but I'm sure some people are wondering, have you ever had a brand ambassador cause trouble for KaBOOM, whether intentionally or unintentionally? And what did you do about it if that happened?
Yeah. Our biggest challenge, so fortunately, because we don't have a real contentious cause or a cause that, a lot of people could be against, we don't get a lot of the classic traditional crisis communications or people speaking out of turn kind of issues. We have a couple different challenges, though. So one is that we are often going into communities where and sometimes, as happens during the planning process in communities where a violent event might happen, we have to adjust our communications for that kind of thing, just so we have the most sensitivity we can possibly have for the community. I think our biggest challenge as KaBOOM, though, is what I mentioned before about that perception gap, and more specifically, we get frustrated about how we're positioned sometimes. So I'll give you two examples. One is that, a funding partner might refer to us as a playground vendor.
Oh.
Just that we just happen to bring the equipment and just show up to do that. The other are sometimes we are also referred to, and this happens more in the media rather than individual community partners, as a grantor, as the organization that just gives money to the community so that they can build a play space. And what that diminishes is our years of expertise, the way that we put, a thoughtful, careful, years, honed by years, communications and community engagement process, the way that we think about innovation of play equipment and are trying to make sure that we're giving the best to every community, and then knowing how to bring people together to actually get the work done and get it done quickly. I mean, those are really valuable components, and so that it diminishes the work that we bring to the table and the role and the value that we bring. And that's our biggest frustration.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a lot of organizations on the line here today that share similar frustrations, and it's hard to manage. And maybe we can get into, in the audience Q&A, into what you do a little bit more, but not a challenge that you're in alone. So last question from me before we transition over to the audience's Q&A. What advice would you give to an organization that's really just starting out on this journey of turning their stakeholders into brand ambassadors? If you had to pick just one piece of sage advice, what would it be?
So I think that what we've seen, and we've talked about this earlier, is to learn about them. Really understand where they're coming from. What do they want? What are their needs? Why are they working with you? Sometimes you think they're working with you for one reason, and they might be working with you for another. Because if you don't have that information, it's hard to create any kind of tools or training programs or path for them to be able to become storytellers on your behalf and your cause's behalf. So really getting to know them, I think, is the most important piece.
That's great. I am in agreement with you on that. I cannot overstate the importance of really getting to know your stakeholders inside and out, using those research tools we talked about, but also just having personal relationships with them, encouraging others on your communications team to really get out there and get to know your stakeholders. So important. So I second that piece of advice. So now turning over to audience Q&A, and we have about 15 minutes left for this. Conversation was really flowing there, so I didn't want to cut in too early with audience Q&A, but I know that you all have some questions as well. So we'll start with one from Haley, and as we go through this question, the rest of you, please use the questions box to chat in more questions for Amy or for me. With a few others I'll come back to as well. Haley asks, what does internal spokesperson training look like at KaBOOM?
So it is, it's actually multi-part. So oftentimes, because our project managers are on the front lines, literally in communities and talking to local reporters, we do practice sessions where we have them work through talking points, work through creating their own talking points, and we do day-long communications trainings. We also videotape them and ask them to answer questions on tape so they can go back or digitally, so they can go back and watch themselves and see what they did. And we do some group support and also some group advice giving. It's actually really helpful for them to see each other go because they learn from each other. So it's a pretty intense process with our project managers. And then for everyone else, we have a set of a messaging framework and a set of messages about the different aspects of our work that people have access to anytime they need it.
That's great. Good example for others to learn from. And I think really varying the level of intensity and how you're providing that training or support based on people's roles is important to make this something that's manageable for your communications team.
I also think it's really important to make sure that you are accessible and create a safe and trusted environment. You know, I've definitely had staff colleagues come to me after the training to say, I'd love to spend another half hour with you to work through something, or I've got this really tough project that's coming up. Can we talk through how I'm going to position it and what I'm going to say? So creating that environment of trust is really important so you can have one-on-one conversations after the training as well.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so circling back to something that we talked about just a moment ago, Heidi asks, how do you respond if influencers spread misinformation or the message goes in the wrong direction? So maybe using that media example where you're referred to incorrectly, Amy, or something like that, where there's misinformation, it might not be malicious. How do you respond and get things under control, or when do you choose not to respond?
Yeah, you know, I think that in those kinds of situations, it for the most part, it doesn't serve well to respond directly. What is good is to recognize that it happened and then try to do some proactive messaging and proactive work to talk about the breadth of the work that we do via storytelling. So we wouldn't, respond to someone calling us a vendor by saying, we're not a vendor, we do this.
Right.
We might respond by saying, let's tell you the story of, this community and how our work led to XYZ results, trying to inoculate it and drive a lot of the other messages that we want to drive is really the way to handle most of the situations that we come up against.
Sure.
And I think that it's really important to know that it's going to happen, that people are going to speak out of turn. I think that there are other organizations, though, that are in much more dicey situations where you might need to respond directly because someone is speaking out against your values. And when that happens, I think that direct response and coming up with something that you and your senior staff feel really comfortable addressing can be really important so that you protect the values of your organization.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Bob asked a similar question, which I think we've mostly addressed already, but I want to make sure that we get at it head on. He said, please discuss strategies for protecting our brand as we increase the number of brand ambassadors. So, for example, if we let loose our logo, what's to stop it from being misused by a helpful or malicious volunteer? And Amy, you already mentioned that you don't police things incredibly strongly, but talk about that, about your viewpoint on as your number of brand ambassadors increase, or even as your organization grows, anything new or different that needs to be done to make sure that your brand isn't misused.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the stakeholder relationships because, what happens to us quite a bit is, and you have to be prepared to have awkward conversations and just get through them. We have a lot of very enthusiastic partners who like to take our logo, to your point, Bob, and, maybe put different colors in it or put it on something that we might not want it on. And so if we have a strong relationship, then we can go back to them and say, we are so glad you're excited. These are some ways we're comfortable with you using our logos. Here's some guidelines. How about we do the T-shirt this way, And so again, you can have those conversations much easier if you have those strong relationships.
Absolutely. Yes. Everything comes back to relationships, right? I think that's true of just about every aspect of marketing and communications, especially when we
Absolutely.
talk about brand ambassadors. Okay, so Mark asks, any recommendations on the easiest to use format for sharing social media post examples and templates with stakeholders? He says, I've tried emails, PDFs, etc., but nothing with a widespread appeal yet. I have some thoughts on that, but Amy, anything that's working for you and KaBOOM?
I I would make it so that it's easy to cut and paste, or for people to, in fact, actually having folks retweet our tweets or follow our lead within the social media channel itself has seemed to work pretty well for us. But Alyssa, I feel like this would be something that I'd love to learn from you too.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with that completely. The easier, the better. I also think that I showed you that library from Charity Water, and I think having something like that accessible on your site with templated posts and cover photos and that sort of thing is helpful. But ultimately, I think what you need to know is that whether you send an email, you have it posted on your website, whatever, your stakeholders are not going to seek out opportunities to go grab something down from your site or your email and post it on their social. Sharing and engaging on social is an of the moment decision that people make when they see something that compels them and when it's easy. So, I think the more you can think about your content strategy and your content calendar, so to speak, from the perspective of what's shareable and what's immediately actionable for our stakeholders, the better. And the more you can take sort of a campaign mindset versus a post by post mindset and thinking about what's going to be shareable, the better. So our very first webinar in this entire series was with the ALS Association, and that's the gold standard, right, for social media shareability. But they built an entire campaign that had a lot of, the classic elements of shareability. There was something kind of funny and embarrassing going on with the ice bucket challenge. It was accessible for anyone who had a bucket and some water to participate. The very nature of the campaign made it easy for people to get involved and engaged and pass it on. So think about things like that. Where can you start a campaign rather than just having a post or a broad message that people might be interested in sharing, and then just make it easy, make it easy, make it easy. That's the main point there. So yeah, I think there's a lot of good examples, and ALS Association is a bigger one, but of organizations that do things on a campaign basis like that just becomes so easily shareable and viral.
Yeah, and in some of our campaign planning, that's such great advice, Alyssa. In some of our campaign planning, we're trying to see in advance and or be opportunistic about what's happening within the social media channels. So one of the examples that we planned for was Mr. Rogers' birthday. And what a tweet would look like on that day. So hooking into something that is a part of the national conversation or the national mindset can also be beneficial. And if you're seeing something trending that really aligns well with your brand or with your cause, taking advantage of that too.
Right.
The example that I saw recently where this worked really well, it was in a for-profit realm, but Southwest Airlines created this hilarious spoof video about one of their flight attendants whose name is Jon Snow. And they put it out on Friday, right before, Game of Thrones weekend, this past weekend, and talked about, and he did this adorable thing about, I get a lot of feedback and people say interesting things to me. And it was just perfect, right? It was such a good way to poke some fun at themselves and, tap into, a big story in the out in the culture. So yeah, I thought that was brilliant.
They found the cultural moment, and I think also notable about that is Southwest Airlines brand voice is kind of that cheeky, personal. They're always featuring their staff at all different levels. That's their brand voice, so that felt totally authentic and in sync with that. That wouldn't work for every organization. So looking for opportunities, like you said, Amy, to play off things that are current, are trending, but doing it in a way that's authentic to the brand. Okay, and we'll take one last question here before we wrap up. Again, on social media, popular topic for all of you. Susan asks, do you train your brand ambassadors on how to use social media at all? And I'm assuming she means primarily your internal, but speak to either.
We don't do a lot of proactive social media training. I mean, We do training, of course, for our own team. We do some staff training. We actually have had some success in holding for our staff internal brown bags. So, lunches where we'll walk through the social media strategy or walk through the different platforms. Don't be scared of Twitter. Here's how you use it. Those kinds of things. We found the most success by doing it informally because social media is so personal. Right. And people have varying levels of comfort with the varying channels and social media platforms. So we try to just, offer up information for anybody who might be interested. But we haven't done a lot of proactive training. I would think for those of you with really active boards, I don't know, Alyssa, what you think about that. That might be a good idea to do, particularly if you have board members who want to speak out and want to show up for your cause and for the work. I could see social media training being a real benefit to them.
Yeah, we have done quite a few board member trainings, and they're often sort of the 101 level training on social media, given the demographic of many of the boards that we work with. We work with a little bit older boards, people who aren't as social media proficient, and they're really excited about the power and potential of social media, that they're not even sure where to begin on Twitter in general, for instance, not just about sharing about our client on Twitter, but what's a tweet? How do I retweet? Some of those sorts of basics can really be helpful to a board member who wants to get out there and be active and share, but they need that basic primer. Of course, not all boards fit that description. Susan chatted in as a follow-up. We have cautious volunteers. And yeah, Susan, I think that's a good case for doing some sort of kind of training or introductory work, just helping people get a little bit more comfortable with how to use the tools, how to talk about your organization. We've also had some good success with training staff from the perspective of, it can be really challenging, even if you're comfortable with social media, to promote an organization that's also your employer, right? Especially if you have privacy concerns about your employer's access to your social media and kind of the lines that could or should be drawn there. So volunteers and staff can really benefit from that sort of training as well, and possibly for some reassurance about the employer or the organization they're volunteering for is acknowledgement of their privacy considerations. So a whole lot more that could be said about that, but I would encourage you, if you have an audience that's hungry for training, to provide some sort of training, keep it light and informal, and help people feel that it's a safe thing for them to do to talk about your organization on social. Okay, well, thank you. Our great audience here chatted in so many questions that I'm not going to be able to get to, so we'll try to cover those in future blog posts and things. It's always great fodder for us to think about future blog topics, but I'm sure you all agree with me. Amy, you have been so helpful and informative, learned a ton from talking with you today, and I wish we had more time to continue the conversation.
Well, it's been really fun to be here with all of you and talk about this work, and I feel much less alone with all of you out there struggling with the same things, and I wish everybody a lot of success in your stakeholder and ambassador strategy program.
Well, thanks. And yes, that's one of our goals here, is to create some community. It can be so isolating working in a marketing and communications role at a nonprofit, especially if you are a department of one. So know that none of you are alone, and some of the challenges that Amy talked about today, I know a lot of you are facing, but you're in it together, and hopefully can be a support network for each other. That said, we are actually in the next month or so going to be launching a private online community for our webinar participants to kind of chat and share ideas and work through challenges together. So keep an eye out for that, which we'll introduce on the next webinar. So that's a perfect transition to this almost final slide here. Our next webinar is on May 8th, and it's going to be a little different than our usual format. Since this topic is really the meatiest and most important commitment in the manifesto, at least I think so, we're actually foregoing a traditional guest discussion with a nonprofit practitioner. And instead, May's webinar is going to be structured as a conversation between myself and our CEO, Lindsay Mullen, on how to develop a marketing plan that moves your mission forward. Marketing planning is such a huge topic. There's so much to cover, and we really want to give you actionable steps for looking at your strategic plan, your organization's goals, and then stepping out, developing a marketing plan that works in sync with that strategic plan, with your goals, with your mission. We want you to be able to walk away with the knowledge and tools that you need to either overhaul an existing marketing and communications plan or build a new one from the ground up that's aligned with moving your mission forward. So can't wait for that. We'll also, like I said, be unveiling that community at the next webinar. So if you're interested, you can sign up at prosper-strategies.com/webinars. I chatted that link into you all as well. And it's also going to be linked within the follow-up email that I'll send. So hope to see you all there in May. Get ready with Lindsay and be ready to answer all of your questions about marketing planning. Should be a good one. So in the meantime, I hope that you will all continue building toward your marketing revolution with this great advice that you've received from Amy today. Again, Amy, thank you so much. And let me know, any of you, if I can be of help between now and the next webinar. Here's my contact information and our URL. And we will be sending around the slides and the recording within the next day or two here. As I mentioned, I am out at a conference today and tomorrow, so it might be a little bit more delayed than usual, but know that you will receive them. Thank you all again so much for joining. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.